Hello everyone. So let's discuss about different terminologies that are used to describe the position of fetus in utero during the intrauterine life. Now first of all, let's discuss about lie. Now lie is actually the relationship of the long axis of the fetus with the long axis of the centralized uterus. Now let's say for example that this is the uterus. So this dotted line will be the long axis of the uterus. Now if this is the fetus, let's say this is the head of the fetus and this is the buttock end of the fetus, then the long axis of the fetus would be this one, red line. The relationship between this long axis of the fetus with the long axis of the uterus is actually known as lie. And when the long axis of the fetus and the long axis of the uterus is in the same line, this is known as the longitudinal lie, which is seen most commonly in 99.5% cases. But sometimes the fetus may lie transversely like this along the long axis of the uterus. So in this case, this is the long axis of the uterus. The fetus is lying transversely. The long axis of the fetus is in an angle of 90 degree with the long axis of the uterus. So this is known as transverse lie. And if the fetus remains at an oblique position like this, then this is known as oblique lie. And oblique and transverse lie is seen very rarely in 0.5% cases. And in extreme rare cases, the lie can be unstable, in which the lie keeps changing throughout the pregnancy. So here is a diagram. And in the first photo, you can see that the long axis of the fetus, which is indicated by the blue dotted line here, is actually in the same line with the longitudinal axis of the uterus. So this is a longitudinal line. In the last picture, you can see that the long axis of the fetus makes an angle of 90 degree with the long axis of the uterus. So this is a transverse line. And here in the third picture, the fetus lies lies obliquely. So this is an oblique lie. Here the angle is not 90 degree, but the fetus is also not longitudinally lying inside the uterus. But the second picture is a bit interesting. Here it might seem that the fetus is in oblique lie, because as you can see that this blue dotted line, which indicates the long axis of the fetus, is lying obliquely with the maternal spine, right? But if we look closely, we can see that the uterus itself is oblique here. And if we draw the long axis of the uterus, that will be this one. And we can see that the long axis of the uterus is actually in the same line with the long axis of the fetus. And if we correct the obliquity of the uterus here, this will be exactly like this, a typical longitudinal lie. So this one is also an example of longitudinal lie, because if the uterus is centralized here, the long axis of the fetus will be in same line with the long axis of the centralized uterus. So that's all about lie. Now let's talk about presentation. Now first of all, let's say this is the uterus. We know that the lower pole of the uterus is actually narrower than the upper pole, right? The upper pole is wider than the lower pole of the uterus. And we know that the head of the fetus is actually the heaviest part of its body. Now, as the head of the fetus is actually the heaviest part of the body, let's say these are the hands and legs of the fetus. Now, if the head is the heaviest part of the body of the fetus, then due to gravity, during the course of pregnancy, the head is going to occupy the lower pole of the uterus, right? In most of the cases, there are obviously exceptions, but in most of the cases, the head occupies the lower pole of the uterus during pregnancy. And it also allows the fetus to be accommodated within the uterus easily, because the head end is obviously narrower than the breech end. So the narrow head end can easily accommodate within the narrow lower pole of the uterus. So the part of the fetus that occupies the lower pole of the uterus is actually known as presentation, and in most of the cases the head end of the fetus occupies the lower pole of the uterus, which is known as cephalic presentation, which is seen in 96.5% cases. But in 3% cases the case can be completely opposite, where the head can remain at the upper pole of the uterus and the breech end or the buttock can occupy the lower pole of the uterus, which is known as the breech presentation, which is seen in 3% cases. And in 0.5% cases, the shoulder or any other part of the body may occupy the lower pole of the uterus, which then would be known as shoulder or other presentation respectively. And sometimes, which is very rare, more than one part of the fetus may occupy the lower pole of the uterus, which is known as compound presentation. So here is a figure that describes presentation. In the first photo, you can see that the head end of the fetus is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. So this is a cephalic presentation. Here the buttock of the fetus is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. So this is breech presentation. And here the back of the fetus is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. Now before moving on to the next topic, which is presenting part, let's take a look here closely. In this picture, the head end of the fetus is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. So this is cephalic presentation, right? Now, this portion here is the cervix, right? And if this is the cervix, then this is the internal os of the uterus, right? And this is the external os. Now, the presentation here is cephalic presentation, right? Now the part of the presentation that overlies the internal os, which is the vertex here, right? And the vertex is overlying the internal os here directly, as we can see in this picture. So the part of the presentation that overlies the internal os is known as the presenting part. So I'm going to repeat this again. The presentation here is cephalic presentation, right? Because the head is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. Now the vertex portion of the head is overlying the internal os of the uterus. So here the presenting part will be the vertex, and in most of the cases the vertex is the presenting part in case of cephalic presentation. But let's move on. In some cases you can see that the head is flexed in typical cephalic presentation, where the vertex is the presenting part. But in some cases the head may be deflexed, right? So we'll be coming back to this, but let's talk about the definition of presenting part before going to that. So the part of the presentation which overlies the internal os is the presenting part of the fetus, and in case of cephalic presentation, in most of the time the vertex is going to be overlying the internal os, so the presenting part is going to be vertex. But when the head is slightly deflexed, like in this picture here, you can see the vertex is actually not overlying the internal os this time, right? The vertex is here and the internal os is here. So the brow is actually overlying here. So this is known as a cephalic presentation where the presenting part is brow. And in some rare cases, like in this last picture, the head might be so deflexed that the face may overlie the internal os. And here the presentation is obviously cephalic presentation because the head is occupying the lower pole of the uterus. But as the face is overlying the internal os of the uterus, the presenting part here will be face. Similarly, if the fetus is in breech presentation, there can be three scenarios. First of all, which is typical, the legs might remain flexed, which is known as complete breech, as we can see here. But sometimes the legs might be slightly extended like this, and that is called frank breech. And in many rare cases, the legs might be so extended that the foot may overlie the internal os. The foot may directly overlie the internal os, and this is known as footling. So the fetal leg in breech position can be in complete breech, which is completely flexed, that can be extended, which is known as Frank bridge, and sometimes the foot itself may be the presenting part overlying the internal os. This is known as footling. So this was all about presentation. Now let's move on to the next topic, which is the attitude of the fetus. Attitude is a very easy topic to understand. It is actually the relationship between different parts of the fetus. And if we look at the picture here, this is a very typical picture. We can see that all the limbs, both upper limb and lower limb, and the head itself, and all the joints of this fetus is in a flexed position, right? So this is known as a flexion as attitude, which is the universal attitude of the fetus. So attitude is actually the relationship between different part of the fetus, and the universal attitude is flexion. But there may be some exception, like we have seen before. Like in brow presentation, the head is not completely flexed, right? It is slightly deflexed. And in face presentation, the head is so much deflexed or extended. So in case of brow presentation or in case of face presentation, the vertex may be deflexed, and as we have discussed earlier, in breast presentation the legs might be extended in some cases. So the universal attitude is actually flexion, but sometimes different part of the body may be extended in rare cases. Now an important topic is denominator. The denominator is actually an arbitrary bony fixed point. We fix a point of the presenting part, a bony point, right? So we have discussed about the presenting part earlier, that the portion of the presentation that overlies the internal os of the uterus, right? Now if the fetus is in a vertex presentation, if the vertex is overlying the internal os, like in this first picture here, the vertex is overlying here, right? Then the occiput is called the denominator. If it is in brow presentation, like this third picture here, if it is in brow presentation, then the frontal eminence is called the denominator. And if it is in face presentation here, then the chin is called the denominator. So we can see here that in vertex presentation, the occiput is actually the denominator. In face presentation, the mentum is the denominator, the mentum or the chin here. And in brow presentation, the frontal eminence is the denominator. If the fetus is in breast presentation, which means if the buttock remains at the lower pole of the uterus, then the sacrum here is the denominator. And if it is in shoulder presentation, then the acromion would be the denominator. So that's all about denominator. And now let's move on to the last topic, which is the position of the fetus. Now before discussing position, I want to discuss that the pelvis, let's say for example that this is the pelvis, this is the sacrum behind, right? This is the sacrum, this is the sacrum behind, and this is the anterior portion of the pelvis, this is symphysis pubis. So the pelvis is actually divided into 8 quadrants. Each quadrant is 45 degree. So it is divided into 8 quadrants like this. So 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, each quadrant is 45 degree. So the 360 degree of the pelvis is divided into 8 quadrants like this, and the relationship of the denominator with these different quadrants is known as the position. Now for keeping the topic simple, we are going to discuss the position in case of vertex. In case of vertex, if the vertex is the presenting part of the fetus, what is going to be the position? So let's say for example that the fetus is in a cephalic presentation, which means the head end is occupying the lower pole of the uterus, and the vertex is the presenting part, so which means the internal os is overlaid by the vertex. So in that case, what would be the denominator? The denominator will be occiput, right? In Bartek's presentation, the denominator is occiput. Now, according to the location of this occiput, as you can see that this is the occiput here, right? This is the occiput here. This is the occiput. This is the occiput. Now, the relationship of this denominator in this case, which is the occiput with different quadrants of pelvis, is known as the position. So, in this one, the occiput is occupying the anterior portion, right? So this is known as the occiputo-anterior position, which is seen in 2% cases. And this is the left side, so this is left occiputo-anterior. This is left occiputo-transverse. This is right occiputo-anterior. This is right occiputo-transverse. This is left occiputo-posterior. If you look here closely, the occiput is actually posteriorly, and it is left occiputo-posterior. It is slightly in the left side. And this is right occiputo-posterior, where the occiput is posteriorly and slightly on the right side. And this is occiputo-posterior, where the occiput is completely posteriorly in the posterior quadrant, right? So this is position, which indicates the relationship of the denominator, which in our example was the occiput, because the baby is in a cephalic presentation with the vertex being the presenting part. So the denominator in this case is occiput. So this relationship is actually known as the position, and I think I was able to describe all the terminologies. These are all the different terminologies that are used in different gynecological and obstetrical cases. So I hope you enjoyed the class. Thank you very much.